Welcome to the 5th of May. Yes, you might tell me that you know what this is. This is Cinco de Mayo. However, this is just an excuse to Americans to go and eat some burritos, even though it's supposed to celebrate the victory of the Mexican army against the French. What we are celebrating instead is the 761st anniversary of Kublai Khan being proclaimed emperor. Many people will remember Genghis Khan, but Kublai Khan was the one that focused on unifying China. He was the first non-ethnically Chinese emperor, non-Han Chinese emperor of all of China. He's the one who chose Beijing as the capital of China, which still stands today, and he did some pretty cool stuff, for the record. Talking about cool stuff, we have to interrupt our previously scheduled quest to find a spec to play in 9.1, which we went on yesterday, talking about how fast and how slow specs are. That was for healers and tanks. We were supposed to go on to the DPS, but we have gotten interrupted by a new build of 9.1's PTR, which is build 38549, which has added a few more things related to balance and related to gameplay. One of which is the new Covenant-Specific Legendaries being added to Demon Hunter. Then we have the rebalance of the balance that happened to Affliction Warlock and to Balance Druid. We have gotten also some retouching, pretty important retouching being done to the Sylvanas bow, the Hunter-specific bow that is going to drop from the raid, from the new raid Sanctum of Domination. So we're going to go over that right now, starting from the newly added legendaries for Demon Hunter. Now, what needs to be pointed out for Demon Hunter legendaries is that Vengeance is pretty locked in the legendary they are using, which is Fiery Soul. Fiery Soul is very crucial to their build. It gives them cooldown reduction to their Firebrand. Firebrand is their main source of defensiveness. After self-healing, Firebrand is going to take most of the brunt of the damage reduction. This is crucial because, for example, the popularity of Mythic Plus Vengeance Demon Hunter comes from being able to have very short cooldown, reusable every pull, always usable every big pull that you have to go for, and Fiery Soul, this legendary, is a pretty big help in making this happen. It fits very well the kiting meta, where you want to jump in, use all your cooldowns, and by the time your cooldowns are ending, you can just jump out and kite. Vengeance can do all of that very well. This legendary helps them a lot. So of course, when you see that there are new Covenant-themed, Covenant-flavored legendaries, it's going to be pretty hard for these new legendaries to be able to attack, to be able to siege the power in which Fiery Soul is right now for Vengeance. When it comes to Havoc, it's a little bit different, because Havoc, on the other hand, doesn't really have too powerful of a legendary. It doesn't have a cornerstone legendary which turns the entire spec around, like Balance of All Things for Balance Druid, for example. It doesn't have something that can break the 10% damage increase, even reach the 12% damage increase as a legendary, which some of the specs can do. Havoc is sitting on the 7-ish, 8% damage increase from the legendary, which isn't very high. It's middle of the pack, maybe even slightly below middle of the pack. The legendaries are not too exciting, which means it is possible that if one of these legendaries is particularly powerful, it could be used, especially when you're not using your legendaries because they are heavily changing the way you play or the way the synergy works within your own rotation, but simply because it gives you damage. So you take the legendary, you sim it. If A sims higher than B, then you can take A because you are a DPS and that's what you care about. For tanks, on the other hand, is much more complicated. There are other things you need to look at when you want to become stronger as a tank, not just damage done. So, looking at the legendary. The first one, we are going with the least important because it's the least played, Covenant. So, it's the one that makes the most sense, which is Demonic Oath. When Fodder to the Flames Demon explodes, it inflicts Firebrand to 5 nearby enemies for 5 seconds. Additionally, Shatter Soul's duration, which is the extra damage increase you gain from hitting people with the explosion, is increased by 8 seconds. The effect in itself might even be good. There is a problem. This entire effect is tied to an ability that has a 2-minute cooldown. That is all there is to it. There isn't really anything particularly powerful with this ability when it comes to raid encounters. It's not really that powerful. It's not going to make this type of tank very powerful in raid encounters just because you have this ability. So what matters is Mythic Plus. Is this good in Mythic Plus? No. It's not good because, back to the original point, it has a 2-minute cooldown and no way in your kit to reduce the cooldown of this ability. So it's bad because the cooldown is too long. You're not going to be able to use this every pull often enough to be up a lot like you can with Fiery Soul and Firebrand. So this shouldn't really go and take the place of Fiery Soul for Vengeance Demon Hunters. What about Havoc? Could this take the place of the other two legendaries? Very, very difficult, because Havoc is already playing with Nightfey, so you would have to beat not only the legendary for Nightfey, but also the passives, the Soulbind passives that you can take in Nightfey, which are the strongest for a Havoc player, and for pretty much many of the other DPS specs. There are even specs playing Necrolord or Venthyr who would be gaining more damage going Nightfey, but they won't, simply because their Covenant ability is stronger. But the passives are pretty powerful for Nightfey, so it is pretty unlikely that Havoc is going to go for this type of Covenant ability, even with this legendary buff. Now on to the next one, which is going to be Venthyr. Agony Gaze is going to give Sinful Brand 10% increased damage, and Eye Beam damage increases the duration of Sinful Brand by half a second. When it comes to Vengeance, of course, it's the same thing, except it is going to be tied to Fell Devastation. Now, for the purpose of Mythic Plus, for the purpose of multiple pulls, this is already a little bit more viable. In fact, twice as viable as Demonic Oath, because it has a 1-minute cooldown. So we are kind of in the realm of being able to be used very often in Mythic Plus. Sinful Brand dealing 10% more damage is okay, but it's not that Sinful Brand is a major part of your total damage done anyways, so this 10% is not going to amount to much. As well as Eye Beam increasing the duration of Sinful Brand, which is also, of course, going to increase its damage if it lasts longer, is also not going to be that impactful for both Havoc and Vengeance. Vengeance doesn't really care too much if you extend the duration of Sinful Brand with Fell Devastation. Not to mention, in this specific case, you would also have to be losing Elysian Decree, because you would have to be moving away from Kyrian as a Vengeance Demon Hunter, which would be terrible. You would have to trade Elysian Decree for Sinful Brand just to get them this extra buff on a legendary, so it's very unlikely it is going to happen. Now, on the two legendaries that have the highest chance of being picked, because they are already in the right Covenant, which is Kyrian and Nightfey. For Kyrian, you have Blind Faith. Elysian Decree shatters 2 additional Lesser Soul Fragments and grants you Blind Faith for 20 seconds. For each Lesser Soul Fragment you consume, while Blind Faith is active, you gain 1% Mastery and 10 Fury. So obviously this has the eyes of Vengeance on it, because they already play Kyrian, like 95% of Vengeance players are Kyrian, so is this going to be better than Fairy Soul, the legendary they are already using? Now, shattering additional soul fragments is pretty good. With Elysian Decree, it's going to give you more healing when you do. Of course, it's going to lack the synergy of reducing the cooldown of Firebrand, because you wouldn't be able to use Fairy Soul legendary. You would have to replace it with this one. This one is a little bit harder to gauge. It's not that it's going to be giving you a new cooldown, it's not going to give you anything special. It is going to give you, though, a 20-second buff on Elysian Decree, and Elysian Decree has a pretty small cooldown, because Elysian Decree, by its own, has a 60-second cooldown. So 60-second cooldown with a buff that lasts for 20 seconds, it's already giving you a 33% uptime on a Mastery and Fury Generation buff, which is already pretty nice on its own. So maybe this one could be more worth than any of the others. Of course, as a reminder, it is having the great benefit of already being placed in Kyrian. So Vengeance only has to think about replacing the legendary and not also replacing Elysian Decree. That's what's helping here. What is also helping is the possibility for the Havoc version for Nightfey, which is Blazing Slaughter. The hunt engulfs you with Immolation Aura upon reaching your target, and you gain 3% agility for 12 seconds for each enemy hit. Now, of course, there is the sad part of this legendary, which the scaling, stacking, agility buff is only based on enemy hit. So, of course, as it is very much in Havoc's style, I guess, the buff is AoE focused, is AoE centered. Many of Havoc's mechanics are AoE centered, and this legendary is just as well. So this, of course, looks like it could have a much better uptime and also strength when it comes to Mythic Plus. Multiple. There is a multitude of targets you can hit with the hunt and get your agility to stack up. The hunt also has a manageable cooldown in Mythic Plus because it's 90 seconds, so it's not blisteringly fast, but it's not too long either. So you should be able to have this available for all the major pools, all of the bigger pools. Don't forget that for now, at least, Prideful is gone, so the big pool of the Prideful spawning for the moment is gone, so you don't have to worry about that big pool. Now, the tooltip doesn't mention any sort of target capping, so I'm sure there will be, otherwise some cheese will be available, like pulling a pack of 20 enemies and getting 60% agility for 12 seconds. That is not going to work. It's definitely going to be capped at some point, but even if it caps at 5 and gives you 15% agility for 12 seconds, that's still pretty decent. Also, not to discount, you are getting a free Immolation Aura when you cast the Hunt. Now, this is just a typical case of numbers. Whether or not this is going to be worth using in Mythic Plus, it is certainly going to have a chance of being used based on how good it is, and now considering that all the other Mythic Plus flavored legendaries for Havoc are also just giving you pure damage. So as long as this one out-damages the other, then it's going to be a possibility for Havoc. These were the 4 legendaries added for Havoc. Now, what we do have is the changes to the changes applied specifically to Balance and Affliction. So, starting with Balance, because it's the juiciest one. Balance has got the New Moon buffed by 33%. The spell power damage of New Moon was 75%. Now it's 100% of your spell power. Now, the original post by Blizzard actually mentioned both New Moon and Half Moon to be buffed by 33%. Now, the tooltip change actually doesn't reflect this, not even in Half Moon, but maybe it's going to come later. What seems to be the case, though, is that Full Moon, so the final hit, is not getting buffed. Only the first 2, the New Moon and the Half Moon. The other changes are reverts of previous nerfs related to Solstice and Stellar Drift. Solstice used to cause, inside Eclipse, shooting stars to fall 300% more often, and it was nerfed to 200. After which, it is now getting buffed back to 250. So, the typical way of Blizzard, first you over-nerf, then you buff it again to about halfway of what the original nerf was supposed to be. Now, it is worth mentioning that Solstice has already been proxy nerfed by the fact that Balance of All Things has gotten nerfed, because Balance of All Things gives you crit when you enter Eclipse, and because Solstice procs in the first few seconds of Eclipse, it was also benefiting from the extra crit of Balance of All Things, and the crit of Balance of All Things getting nerfed also affected Solstice. The real change, though, the real crucial change, is the change to Stellar Drift. This was the bigger change because it was so bad that it turned Stellar Drift into a DPS loss if you were trying to do AoE. That's how bad it was. So, people hoped, thought, expected that this nerf would have gotten reverted into a different type of nerf to Starfall. Yes, even the most biased of Balance Druids could acknowledge that Starfall was overtuned. It was allowing Balance Druids for too much damage with way too little effort, and also way too smart. The smart targeting of Starfall with the size of Starfall was just too simple. However, Blizzard gave themselves a few days to think about it, to think about what to change about this. The biggest concern of Balance players was the 15-second cooldown that was being given to Starfall, making it a nightmare, because now Starfall would last for 8 seconds with a 15-second cooldown, so you would barely get above a 50% uptime. During heavy AoE situations, it does not feel nice. Imagine getting into an AoE, being able to Earthquake only 50% of the time, because the rest of the time is going to be on cooldown. Not cool. So Blizzard comes in with a change, and it's a bad one, because the change is Starfall now deals 50% additional damage instead of 25%. That's it. That's the end of the change. Everything else remains the same. It now still has a 15-second cooldown. So from having a 15% more damage to Starfall without a cooldown to having a 50% more damage to Starfall, but now having a 15-second cooldown. This is still likely not going to be very powerful. The main crux of the issue still remains the fact that it has a cooldown. Not only that, but it also makes it more frustrating to play. It's just anti-fun to have an AoE situation laid in front of you and not being able to click on your AoE ability. It's not that cool. There is also a slight change, a slight retuning of the Balance Druid's legendary Kindred Affinity, the Kyrian one. I mentioned this at the start, it was weird. They were giving 5%, a flat 5% buff of all secondary stats. So they were valuing versatility the same way they were valuing crit, the same way they were valuing mastery. With this change, they are now giving you a flat number to mastery instead of a 5% buff. I still think it's pretty weird. I still think versatility should be lower, for example, than haste and crit, because it's more important. Not only that, but also because of the damage reduction you gain with versatility. And mastery should be a little bit higher, but I don't know, I guess Blizzard is fine with that. The other change, the other rebalance of a balance addition that Blizzard had a few days ago is the one to Affliction Warlock, and this one is to their Conduit. You might have seen some videos or some posts or some images about Withering Bolt, allowing Warlocks, Affliction Warlocks, to get very high damage increases on their Shadow Bolts, because Shadow Bolt and Drain Soul were able to get stacked up in terms of damage percentage increases by multiple abilities. You have this Conduit, you have Decimating Bolt, which is the Necrolord Covenant ability, which can basically double the damage of your Shadow Bolt, plus Malefic Wrath. So all this combined made for some very funny compilations of damage. This Conduit has been nerfed. The base damage of Drain Soul goes from 20% on the Conduit to 10, and the one to Shadow Bolt goes from 40 to 20. And of course the base scaling is getting nerfed as well. I still think this is kind of on the edge. I'm not too sure if this is enough. A rank 6, so a 226 item level, Withering Bolt is going to give your Drain Soul a 16% damage increase. Given that in pretty much every single, at the very least, single target scenario, you will have Siphon Life, Unstable Affliction, Corruption, and Agony on the target, that is at least 4 damage over time effects, which means a 64% damage increase to your Drain Soul. It doesn't have a duration, a limit. No, it's just permanent damage increase. Drain Soul in single target can go even higher than 7% of your damage. Increasing that by 64% within a single Conduit gives you basically 4% more damage in single target. 4% single target damage from a single Conduit is powerful. It's not, the strongest of all Conduits, but it is definitely amongst the strongest available Conduits right now. There is literally only 3 or 4 other Conduits in the game that could beat, theoretically, this one in terms of DPS gain. And a couple of them are getting nerfed, because Dissonant Echoes for Shadow Priest is getting nerfed, and Infernal Cascade for Fire Mage is getting nerfed. So even after this nerf, which is literally cutting this Conduit down by 50% power, it is still one of the strongest Conduits you can take, at the very least for single target damage. What we also have for classes is the official implementation of the Paladin Legendaries in the PTR, with the addition of a nerf. A necessary nerf, which I pointed out before. So Radiant Embers is the Ashen Hallow one. Ashen Hallow's duration is increased by 50%, and leaving the hallowed area will end the effect, and its cooldown will be reduced by up to 50%. This is a slight change, because before it was just leaving the area was reducing the cooldown, which was easily abusable. What you can do, for example, is you just drop it down in front of the boss or the group of mobs so that it clips them, but you stay outside of it. So you don't gain the double damage on Hammer of Wrath, but you gain the full damage of Ashen Hallow ticking on the enemies or healing the friendlies, as well as the cooldown reduction this legendary was giving. Now it's been fixed, so if you pop it down and then leave, it just disappears, and you gain all of the cooldown reduction that you can get based on how much you saved of this cooldown. Duty-Bound Gavel has been introduced as well. You get one more charge of this ability, and you get to have an extra usage of your finisher. And more importantly, Divine Resonance, the Kyrian legendary, has gotten nerfed again. Previously, at the start, using Divine Toll made it repeat itself at 60% effectiveness 3 times. Then it was nerfed to be repeated at 20% effectiveness. Now it's been completely changed, because, as I mentioned, there was too much synergy with Divine Toll, with the Conduit, how much damage it could do and how much benefit you could gain, so Blizzard just gave up. They tried to nerf it, but no dice. The change now makes it so that after casting Divine Toll, you instantly cast Judgment every 5 seconds, lasting 6 times, so you get 6 casts of Judgment total, which is still probably not gonna be too strong. Paladin works a lot in burst windows, small, short windows. A window that lasts for 30 seconds isn't a window, it's a fucking door. So I don't think this is gonna work. For Retribution at least, for sure, and very likely for Holy Paladin as well. Protection is not even in question. Protection has way stronger Conduits they can use. They're not gonna go for this one. We can move over after Paladin pretty quickly, since no other major change happening there. Now, the last of the interesting changes is, as I mentioned, the special bow from Sylvanas. Now, the first interesting change is that it seems like Blizzard is planning to turn this into a legendary. We have gotten the change of this item being put into the Dungeon Journal's loot table, and it is now orange. So that's a possibility. Now, this one has received quite a lot of changes. The release of the ability looked like this. It was mega nerfed from 225% more damage down to 92. Now it's getting buffed again. Double damage from 92.5 to 185. The damage is not the crucial part here. The crucial part is that they left out this, I guess, flavorful text addition. Lesser creatures struck by Welling Arrow are stunned to something much more clear. Targets struck by Welling Arrow are silenced for 5 seconds. They also put back the cooldown, because previously, very confusingly, the cooldown went away. It used to have a 30-second cooldown, and then in the next couple of iterations of this item, the cooldown wasn't even there. Now they are testing it on a 60-second cooldown, a 1-minute cooldown. This is particularly interesting because it is giving the hunters a second interrupt. Not only that, but this is an AoE. This is an 8 yards AoE interrupt. So yeah, it's not like Solar Beam, because it doesn't stick in place for a while, but it is an AoE interrupt. Of course, if it had a 30-second cooldown, it would have been crazy to have a 30-second AoE interrupt on top of your already existing 24-second single target interrupt, so 60-second cooldown seems more balanced, but it is still pretty powerful. As I mentioned, this is an item that isn't really cutting on main stat and secondary stats on the item to give you these effects, so you are still gaining normal stats for the item level of the item, and on top of those you're getting this very powerful special effect, because I have been told that a special effect is stronger than no special effects. So whichever version they decide to have of this special effect is still going to be very powerful, because if you do not have this, you're going to be missing out on AoE damage, you're going to be missing out on AoE silence, so it makes it very good, it makes it very strong, and of course it's going to make hunters a little bit sad that it might take them a while to get this. But I guess this is the nature of what a legendary is. At least what an old school legendary is. I am, to be fair, pretty annoyed that it's a hunter bow. Sure, it drops from Sylvanas, so I guess the bow was thematic, but they could have gone for something a little bit more widespread. A staff, a sword, maybe a mace, a dagger, or just be neutral and make it a ring. But I guess also hunters are like the most played class in the game, so Blizzard is pandering to the majority here. So these were all the changes for today, at least the important PvE related ones. We can see each other tomorrow with the continuation of our quest, our analysis of what specs to play in 9.1. For now, we can leave ourselves. Thank you guys for watching. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, I just think it's a little bit lazy, you know? This is the second legendary bow. Not cool.